It was a beautiful, sunny morning when Kiana stepped out of her house, ready to walk to school. She smiled to herself as she made her way down the sidewalk, feeling confident and free. Her curly hair bounced with every step, and she was proud of it. It was a part of who she was, a symbol of her strength and identity. But today, something was different. Something was about to happen that would change everything. As she walked past the park, a police car pulled up beside her. Kiana was used to seeing officers around, but this one, Officer Daniels, seemed different. He stared at her as he stepped out of the car. He had a stern expression on his face, as though he was already suspicious of her. "Excuse me, young lady," Officer Daniels called out in a sharp voice. Kiana stopped, confused. She hadn't done anything wrong. She looked at him and said politely, "Yes, officer." The officer took a moment to look her up and down, his eyes lingering on her hair. "You're causing a disturbance with your hair," he said, his voice dripping with judgment. Kiana's eyes widened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had always been proud of her natural hair. It wasn't the first time someone had commented on it, but it was the first time a police officer had singled her out for it. She looked at the officer, trying to stay calm. "What do you mean, officer? I'm just walking to school." Officer Daniels didn't seem to care. "You're wearing your hair like that, and it's drawing attention. People like you don't belong here with your wild hair." Kiana felt a surge of anger, but she held it in. She had dealt with ignorant comments before, but this was different. She had never been treated this way by an authority figure. She tried to explain, but Officer Daniels cut her off. "Do you think you're above the rules?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I'll tell you what, get in the car. We're going to make sure you understand how to look proper in this neighborhood." Kiana froze. This couldn't be happening. She was just a student walking to school. Why was the officer treating her this way? But before she could say anything more, he grabbed her by the arm, pulling her toward his car. "Let go of me," Kiana yelled, trying to break free. Her heart was racing and her stomach twisted in fear. She had never been in a situation like this before, and it felt wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. The officer didn't listen to her. He ordered her into the back of the patrol car, and Kiana reluctantly complied, still in shock. She couldn't believe what was happening. How had her walk to school turned into this nightmare? As the officer started the car and drove toward the police station, Kiana sat quietly in the back. She felt humiliated, but she was determined to stay calm. She would find a way to fix this. She just had to be strong, and she had to stay true to herself. But she had no idea how far Officer Daniels was willing to go to prove his point. The tension in the air was thick. Kiana couldn't stop thinking about her hair, the one thing she'd always loved about herself. How could something so simple be used to hurt her? Little did she know, this encounter would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Officer Daniels had no idea who he was dealing with, and soon he would regret underestimating her. Kiana sat quietly in the back of the police car, her heart still racing. The car hummed along the streets, its sirens now silent. She had no idea where they were headed, but she knew it couldn't be good. Officer Daniels, who had been driving in silence, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. His expression was cold, his eyes narrowed as if he was annoyed by her mere presence. The car finally came to a stop in front of the police station. Officer Daniels turned off the engine and stepped out without a word. Kiana hesitated for a moment before slowly opening the door and following him. The cool air of the station hit her as she stepped onto the pavement, but her mind was clouded with confusion and frustration. She didn't understand why this was happening to her. What had she done wrong? "Come on," Officer Daniels barked as he motioned for her to follow. Kiana walked behind him, trying to keep her composure. She could feel the eyes of some of the officers inside the station watching her, and the uncomfortable feeling grew stronger with every step. Once they were inside, Officer Daniels led her to a small room with a chair in the center. He pointed to the chair without speaking, and Kiana reluctantly sat down, still trying to understand what was going on. She looked around the room, the walls bare except for a few police department plaques. There was no sign of a welcoming environment here, just cold, lifeless space. "You're going to learn a lesson today," Officer Daniels said, his voice filled with a sense of superiority. Kiana looked up at him, but she said nothing. Her emotions were a mixture of confusion and anger, but she knew she needed to stay calm. Her father had always taught her to keep her head held high, no matter how difficult things got. "I don't know why you're doing this," Kiana finally spoke up, her voice steady. "I didn't break any laws. I was just walking to school." Officer Daniels scoffed. "It's not just about the law," he said, crossing his arms. "It's about respect. You've been walking around with that wild hair like you don't care what people think. That's not how things work here." Kiana's chest tightened with frustration. She had always worn her hair the way it naturally grew, proud of who she was. Her hair wasn't wild. It was beautiful, just like the rest of her. But she knew arguing with him wouldn't help. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "My hair is part of me. I don't care what anyone thinks. I don't need to change for anyone." Officer Daniels smirked at her words but didn't respond right away. He turned and walked to a small counter, where he picked up a pair of clippers. Kiana's stomach dropped when she saw the shiny blades. Was he really going to do this? "Sit still," he ordered, turning back toward her. Kiana's heart began to race again, but she remained in her seat, determined not to show fear. She knew she had to stand her ground. But as the officer began to approach her, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of injustice. Why was he doing this? Why was he trying to punish her for something as simple as her hair? "Please don't do this," she whispered, but Officer Daniels wasn't listening. He moved closer, his eyes fixed on her hair, as if it was the most important thing in the room. Kiana swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears. This wasn't just about hair. It was about respect, about who she was, and the way others saw her. As the clippers buzzed to life, Kiana closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had to stay strong. She couldn't let him take away what made her feel proud. She wouldn't let him break her spirit. But at that moment, she had no idea just how much this event would change both her life and his. The sound of the clippers filled the small room. Kiana's heart pounded in her chest as she sat frozen in the chair, staring at the floor. She could feel the officer's gaze on her, but she refused to look up. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her scared. She tried to steady her breathing, but the noise of the clippers buzzing so close to her head made it hard to focus. She felt a cold hand on her hair. Officer Daniels was so sure of himself, so confident that he could control the situation. The sharp click of the clippers made her flinch, but she held her ground. She refused to move, to show any weakness. This wasn't just about her hair anymore. It was about her dignity. With a swift motion, the officer began cutting her hair. Kiana could feel the weight of it being lifted from her head as he shaved off her thick curls. It wasn't just the sensation of the clippers moving through her hair. It was the feeling of being diminished, as if her identity was being stripped away. Each snip felt like a small piece of herself was being taken, and it hurt in a way she hadn't expected. Kiana closed her eyes, her mind racing. She thought about her friends, her family, and the people who loved her. How would they feel when they saw her like this? But then, she reminded herself that they would understand. They knew who she was, and no matter what happened, they would always see her the same way. Hair didn't define her, but the officer didn't seem to understand that. He continued cutting, his face locked in concentration, as if he thought he was teaching her a lesson. "You need to learn," he muttered to himself, though Kiana didn't know exactly what he meant. She was learning something all right. She was learning that people like him didn't care about who she was, only about what they could force her to be. The buzzing of the clippers was now all Kiana could hear. She wanted to scream, but she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and focused on staying calm. She thought of her mother, who had always taught her to rise above the negativity in the world. Kiana wasn't going to let one ignorant officer break her. She was stronger than this. Finally, the clippers stopped. Kiana's hair was gone, almost all of it. She could feel the cold air on her scalp and the weight of the silence in the room. Officer Daniels stepped back, a smug look on his face. He seemed pleased with what he had done, as if he thought it was a victory. But Kiana didn't feel defeated. She felt something else, something stronger than the humiliation he had tried to impose on her. She stood up slowly, wiping away a tear that had fallen without her noticing. She didn't want him to see her upset, but she couldn't help it. Her heart was heavy with a mix of anger and sadness. How could anyone treat another person like this? How could an officer, someone who was supposed to protect and serve, do something so cruel? As Kiana looked into the officer's eyes, she knew something important. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. No matter what happened, she was going to make sure that Officer Daniels would never forget what he had done to her. She would make sure he knew that her worth was not in her hair, but in who she was inside. And no one could take that away from her. Word about what happened to Kiana spread quickly. At first it was just a few people talking, but soon it became something much bigger. Her classmates, teachers, and even people in the community began to hear what had happened. The story traveled fast, fueled by the outrage of those who couldn't believe what Officer Daniels had done. Kiana's name was everywhere, but not for the reason she would have ever wanted. She had always known there was racism in the world, but never had she felt it so directly. Kiana wasn't just a victim of an unjust situation. She had become a symbol of something much larger. People were angry, and they had every right to be. Social media exploded with posts, hashtags, and messages demanding justice for Kiana. Her friends were furious. They rallied behind her, leaving messages of support and offering to help however they could. They were determined to make sure Officer Daniels couldn't get away with what he had done. But Kiana wasn't ready to let anyone fight her battles for her. She didn't want to be known for what had happened to her. She wanted to be known for who she was and what she could do. She knew this situation wasn't just about a haircut. It was about standing up for her rights, her dignity, and her worth. Even though she was hurt by what had happened, she knew she had to stay strong and face what was coming head-on. Her phone buzzed with messages all afternoon. Her father, a well-known political figure, called her a few times, but she didn't answer. Kiana didn't want to talk to anyone yet. She needed time to think. Her father had always been there for her, guiding her through the tough times. But this felt different. This was personal. This was about her. She wasn't sure if she wanted to bring her father into it. Not just yet. But by the evening, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Her father had heard the news. He had called her multiple times, and she finally picked up the phone. "Kiana, are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice filled with concern. Kiana took a deep breath. She didn't want to sound like she was falling apart, but she felt like she might. "I'm okay, Dad. Just upset." Her father was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you want me to take care of this?" Kiana paused. Her father had the power and influence to make this situation disappear in an instant, but she didn't want him to fight this battle for her. She wanted to be the one to stand up for herself. "No, Dad, I'll handle it. But thank you." Her father's voice softened. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll support you no matter what." Kiana smiled faintly, grateful for her father's unwavering support. Still, she knew this was something she had to do on her own. This was her fight now. The next day, Kiana walked to school with her head held high. She had shaved her hair, but she refused to let it define her. It was just hair after all. What mattered more was the strength inside her. The people at school who had heard about the incident greeted her with kindness and respect. They understood what had happened, and they stood by her side. But the officer, Officer Daniels, was nowhere to be seen. He had disappeared from the station, leaving everyone to wonder what would happen next. Kiana wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over yet. The fight for justice had only just begun. Kiana couldn't escape the thought of what had happened, no matter how hard she tried. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the clippers on her scalp, the sting of humiliation that came with losing her hair. But what troubled her even more was knowing that her father, a man of great influence and power, had been left in the dark about it all. She hadn't wanted to burden him, but now that he knew, everything felt different. The phone calls were constant. Her father, ever the protector, reached out several times a day, asking her how she was holding up, offering his support. Kiana didn't want to keep him in the dark any longer, so one afternoon, she finally sat down and told him everything. She explained how Officer Daniels had taken matters into his own hands, forcing her into a situation she didn't deserve. Her father was furious. He listened carefully, his usual calm and collected demeanor replaced by a deep, palpable anger. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly, pacing the floor as he spoke. "No one has the right to treat you this way. I won't let it go unnoticed." Kiana's heart pounded as she listened to him. She could feel the weight of his words, knowing just how much power he had. She loved her father, and she knew that if he got involved, things would change. But part of her was torn. She wanted to fight this battle on her own, to prove that she could handle it without his influence. Yet another part of her knew that her father's connections could make sure that justice would be served. "You don't have to do anything, Dad," Kiana said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't want you to make a scene." But her father was resolute. "Kiana, this isn't just about you. This is about all the kids who are treated unfairly because of who they are. If we don't speak up now, nothing will ever change." Kiana felt a rush of emotions. She had always known that her father was a powerful man, but hearing him say that made her realize just how much he believed in standing up for what was right. She was proud of him, but at the same time, she felt torn between letting him take charge and fighting for justice in her own way. "I'll take care of it," her father said, determination in his voice. "But I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. You won't face this alone." Kiana closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Her father's support meant the world to her, and she realized that it was okay to let him help. They didn't have to do everything alone. They could face this together. The next day, her father used his connections in the city's leadership to get in touch with key members of the police department. He made sure they knew about Officer Daniels' actions and demanded an immediate investigation. He didn't waste time. He knew that the longer they waited, the more likely the incident would be swept under the rug. By the end of the day, Kiana's father had already made arrangements for a meeting with the police chief. The pressure on Officer Daniels began to mount, and it became clear that there would be consequences for his actions. As the days passed, Kiana found herself feeling more hopeful. She knew that the fight was far from over, but now, with her father's help, she wasn't alone. Together, they would make sure Officer Daniels would be held accountable for what he had done. As the days passed, Officer Daniels could feel the pressure building. At first, he had thought that his actions would be overlooked, that no one would care about what he had done to Kiana. But he was wrong. Word of the incident spread like wildfire. And soon, it wasn't just Kiana and her family who were upset. The whole community was talking about it, and Officer Daniels was at the center of the storm. He had always prided himself on being a good officer, someone who followed the rules and kept the peace. But now, he found himself questioning everything. The phone calls started coming in from his colleagues, asking if he had really done what the news reports were claiming. He ignored most of them, but the whispers in the station grew louder. People were talking behind his back, and he could feel the judgment. Officer Daniels tried to convince himself that he hadn't done anything wrong. He told himself that Kiana had needed to learn a lesson, that her wild hair had been causing trouble. He had seen her walking through the neighborhood before, and it bothered him. It didn't fit in with what he thought was the right way to look or behave. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that what he had done was not about teaching a lesson. It was about something deeper, something that he hadn't fully understood at the time. He knew he had crossed a line. It wasn't just about shaving Kiana's hair. It was about the way he had treated her. He had made assumptions based on her appearance, and he had used his authority to punish her for something that was completely out of her control. Kiana hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't broken any laws. She had simply been herself. And for that, he had humiliated her. The regret began to eat away at him. He tried to brush it off, but it lingered, nagging him every time he looked in the mirror or heard the news reports about the incident. His actions had become a public scandal, and he couldn't escape it. The department was under pressure to take action, and he knew his career was on the line. But even more than that, he realized that his actions had hurt an innocent person, a person who didn't deserve any of it. One evening, after a long day of dealing with the fallout, Officer Daniels sat alone in his small apartment. He replayed the events in his mind over and over again. He remembered Kiana's face, her eyes full of confusion and fear, and he felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on his own ideas of right and wrong that he hadn't even bothered to see things from her perspective. Now it was too late. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he also knew he had to make things right. He didn't know how, or if it was even possible, but he was determined to try. Officer Daniels had always believed in doing the right thing, but he now realized that it wasn't just about following orders. It was about treating people with dignity and respect, no matter who they were. As the investigation into the incident continued, Officer Daniels found himself facing the consequences of his actions. He had no idea how things would turn out, but he knew that his life and his career would never be the same. And as he thought about Kiana, he couldn't help but hope that one day she might be able to forgive him. The tension in the community grew as more information about the incident came to light. Kiana's story had become more than just an isolated event. It had become a symbol of injustice and a call for change. People from all walks of life were demanding answers, and they weren't going to stop until they got them. The pressure on Officer Daniels and the police department was mounting, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before something had to be done. Kiana, for her part, was trying to stay focused. She had learned that the fight for justice wasn't easy, but it was important. She had hoped that her story would help others who had faced similar situations. She refused to be defined by what had happened to her. Her father, seeing how determined she was, supported her every step of the way. But he knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what Kiana had endured. Then, one day, the truth about who Kiana's father really was hit the public eye in a way that no one expected. Kiana had always kept her personal life private, but with everything that was happening, the media started digging. As the story gained more attention, Kiana's father was revealed to be a highly influential figure in the political world, someone with the power to make real change. The public was stunned. Many had no idea just how much influence he had. The revelation caused a wave of shock and disbelief. Officer Daniels, who had never imagined he was dealing with someone of such importance, felt his stomach drop. He had no idea that Kiana's father was someone who could make or break careers. For the first time, he realized the full weight of what he had done, not just to Kiana, but to someone who had the ability to bring the entire situation to light. Kiana's father, seeing the shift in the atmosphere, didn't waste any time. He called for a press conference, gathering the media and speaking directly to the public. His message was clear. What had happened to his daughter was wrong, and it needed to be corrected. He wasn't just speaking for Kiana. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their appearance, their race, or their background. Officer Daniels, now facing the reality of his actions, began to feel the weight of the situation more than ever. The media was everywhere, asking questions, reporting on his past, and his reputation within the department. He had no idea how things had spiraled so quickly, but now he had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. The investigation into his behavior was becoming more serious, and he couldn't deny the truth anymore. Kiana, though still recovering from the emotional toll of everything that had happened, felt a sense of power. She hadn't sought out the attention, but now that it was here, she knew it was a chance to make a difference. She couldn't change what had happened to her, but she could use her voice to speak out and make sure that no one else had to go through the same thing. She had learned that standing up for herself wasn't just about protecting her dignity. It was about fighting for what was right. As Officer Daniels began to realize the depth of his mistake, he felt a mix of regret and guilt. He had underestimated Kiana and her family, thinking that he could get away with his actions. Now it was clear that the truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. The community had spoken, and the pressure was on for the department to take action. The news about Officer Daniels and the incident with Kiana continued to spread. The community was no longer just shocked, it was united in outrage. People from all walks of life were talking about what had happened, and they were demanding action. Kiana's story had sparked a movement, and there was no going back. She had become the face of a fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race or appearance. Kiana's father, a powerful figure in the community, had made it clear that he would not let the incident go unnoticed. The pressure he placed on the police department was immense, and it wasn't long before they were forced to launch a formal investigation into Officer Daniels' actions. His past mistakes were brought to light, and it became clear that he had a history of questionable behavior. The department could no longer ignore the weight of the situation. Officer Daniels, once so confident in his position, began to feel the full force of the consequences of his actions. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, but now he saw how wrong he had been. The shame of what he had done to Kiana, the young girl he had wrongfully targeted, weighed heavily on him. He had never imagined that his career would be in jeopardy over something like this, but now his future with the police department was uncertain. The investigation moved quickly, with the department's internal affairs team conducting interviews and gathering evidence. Officer Daniels was placed on administrative leave while the inquiry was underway. The pressure continued to mount, not only from the public but from his fellow officers. Many of them were uncomfortable with what had happened, and the department knew it needed to act swiftly to restore trust in the community. For Kiana, the days that followed were a blur of interviews, meetings, and public statements. But through it all, she remained strong. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence her. She had faced the injustice head-on, and now she was determined to make sure Officer Daniels was held accountable for what he had done. At the same time, Kiana was healing. The pain from the incident was still there, but she was beginning to feel the weight lifting. Her hair, though shaved, had already started to grow back, and with it, her confidence. She knew that her worth wasn't defined by her appearance, but it was a part of her identity. The humiliation she had faced wasn't something she would forget, but it was also something she had turned into strength. She had stood up for herself, and now she was proud of the person she had become. Kiana's father, too, was satisfied with the progress being made. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, and now he saw that the department was taking the situation seriously. But more than that, he saw the change in his daughter. Kiana had shown courage in the face of adversity, and it had made a difference. Her voice had been heard, and the community was stronger for it. The investigation continued, but one thing was clear: Officer Daniels would face the consequences of his actions. As for Kiana, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long journey, but she was ready. She had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself meant facing hard truths, but it also meant making sure the world could see your strength, and that strength was something no one could ever take away from her. Weeks had passed since the incident, and Kiana had found herself at the center of a movement for justice and equality. What had started as a painful, humiliating experience had grown into something far bigger than she could have imagined. Her courage and determination had sparked change, and it was clear that her voice was being heard. Officer Daniels, meanwhile, was facing the consequences of his actions. The investigation into his behavior had resulted in his termination from the police department. He had lost his job, his reputation, and the respect of his colleagues. But for Kiana, the process wasn't just about punishment. It was about making sure that what happened to her never happened to anyone else. Justice had been served, but the real victory was the message that had been sent. No one could get away with treating others unfairly. Kiana had been through a lot, but she had never felt prouder of herself. The support from her friends, family, and the community had been overwhelming. They had all rallied around her, standing together to demand change. Her father, always a pillar of strength, had been by her side every step of the way. But Kiana knew this journey had been her own. She had faced the situation with bravery, even when she felt small and helpless. She had turned her pain into power. As the days went by, Kiana's hair slowly began to grow back, but it wasn't just her hair that had changed. She had grown too. The girl who had once been afraid to speak out was now someone who could stand up for herself and others. She had learned the importance of using her voice, of standing firm even when the world seemed against her. Her confidence had been shaken, but it had been rebuilt stronger than before. One afternoon, as Kiana sat with her friends in the school cafeteria, they talked about everything that had happened. Her friends were eager to share how proud they were of her, and Kiana smiled, feeling the deep sense of gratitude for their support. They spoke about how her story had inspired others, encouraging them to stand up for themselves when faced with injustice. It wasn't just about one incident anymore, it was about a movement. And Kiana had been the spark that ignited it. Kiana's father, too, had noticed a change in her. He saw how she carried herself with more strength, how she no longer shied away from difficult conversations. He was proud of the young woman she was becoming. But he was also thankful for one thing above all else. Kiana had shown him that sometimes the best way to protect someone you love is to let them fight their own battles. He had been there when she needed him, but in the end, it was Kiana who had won this fight. And he knew she would continue to fight for what was right. As for Officer Daniels, he had lost much, but he had also learned a valuable lesson, one that he would never forget. His actions had caused harm, but now he understood the importance of empathy, respect, and fairness. He had learned the hard way, but it was a lesson that would stay with him forever. Kiana had faced a painful ordeal, but she had come out of it stronger, wiser, and more determined to make the world a better place. And while she would never forget the hurt she had endured, she knew that the future was hers to shape. She was ready to continue fighting for what was right, knowing that her voice had the power to make a difference.